Once upon a time, there lived a gentleman and his wife who had a beautiful daughter called Ella. One sad day, the mother died, and poor Ella was left alone. A few years later, the gentleman married again, so that now Ella had a stepmother. This stepmother was a hard-hearted woman, and to make matters worse, she had two daughters of her own, both older than Ella, who were just as disagreeable as herself. Besides being disagreeable, they were also very ugly, and being jealous of Ella's beauty did their best to make life a misery for her. After a few months, the gentleman, who had been made very unhappy by the way his new wife and stepdaughters were treating Ella, became ill, and not long afterwards he died, leaving his poor daughter without a friend in the world. As Ella grew up, she became more and more beautiful, and the more beautiful she became, the more her ugly sisters hated her. They treated her worse than a servant, making her do all the housework, wait on them at table, do all their fetching and carrying for them. And no matter how she worked and tried to please them, they never said one word of thanks. They were always rude to her and as spiteful as they could possibly be. While her stepmothers and stepsisters flounced about the house in gowns of silk and satin, poor Ella was dressed in rags. All she had to eat were the scraps of food left on the table when the others had finished. And she was made to sleep in a dark attic where there was only an old straw mattress and a broken chair. Every night, when her work was finished, Ella would go to her lonely kitchen, sit quietly by the fire and gaze at the cinders. It was because of this that her stepsisters nicknamed her Cinderella. But however badly they treated her, she never complained. Instead, she went about her work each day as cheerfully as she could. One day, when Cinderella was gathering sticks in the forest, she met a poor old woman dressed in a long black cloak. She was also trying to gather firewood, but being so old and frail, she could hardly stoop to pick up the twigs. Cinderella felt very sorry for her. "Please, ma'am," she said to the old lady, "take my bundle of sticks. I can easily gather some more." "Thank you, my child," replied the old woman. "That's very kind of you, and one day I promise you your kindness will be rewarded." And with that, the old woman shuffled away and was soon lost to sight among the trees. Gathering some more firewood, Cinderella hurried home to make up the fire in her kitchen and found her stepmother and stepsisters in a state of great excitement. A letter had arrived from the palace inviting the ladies of the household to a state ball to be given by the king's son, who was known all over the land as Prince Charming. Now, it had been rumored that the prince was looking for a bride, so of course the two stepsisters were already preening themselves and telling each other he'd be bound to fall in love with at least one of them. From the moment the invitation arrived, the two stepsisters and their mother could think of nothing but the ball and what they were going to wear. They took all their dresses from the wardrobe and tried them on over and over again, parading in front of their long mirrors, comparing their many costly jewels and trying to decide how they would dress their hair. Of course, they found plenty of work for Cinderella. After her household drudgery was done, she had to set to work on their fine linens and laces and trim and sew for them. As always, she did her very best to please and got nothing but scoldings for her pains. At last, the great day came, and after hours of preparation, the ladies were ready for the ball, and pretty shocking they looked. Alone in her drab kitchen, picturing the gaiety and splendor of the royal ballroom, Cinderella felt very sad. How she would have loved to have danced with the prince. Seizing a long broom and holding it like a dancing partner, she started to waltz round the kitchen to cheer herself up. But it's hard to imagine you're the belle of the ball when you're wearing a dress that's in rags and tatters. And after a moment, Cinderella found she could make believe no longer. Sitting down in front of the fire, she put her head in her hands and she cried. And as she wept, she heard a knock on the door. After a moment, the door opened, and into the kitchen came the old woman Cinderella had met in the forest. "Don't be afraid, my child," said the old woman. "I am here to keep my promise that one day your kindness would be rewarded." "I remember you very well, ma'am," said Cinderella, "but I'm afraid I don't know who you are." "I will tell you, child," said the old woman. "I am your fairy godmother. What is your dearest wish?" "To go to the ball." "And so you shall, but first we must get you a coach to travel in. Run into the garden and fetch me a pumpkin." Cinderella was very surprised at this strange request, but at once she did as she was told and brought a pumpkin from the garden. She set it down in front of the old woman. Now the old woman threw back her long cloak and raised her right hand, and Cinderella was amazed to see that she held in it a magic wand. A wave of the wand over the pumpkin, and it was turned into a magnificent coach, decked with scarlet and gold and lined with satin. "Now see if there are any mice in the trap," said the fairy godmother. Cinderella found there were 6. Another wave of her wand over each of them, and the fairy godmother changed them into handsome ponies, all in golden harness. Another moment, and a rat from the rat trap had become a handsome coachman in splendid livery. Finally, 6 lizards from a flower pot in the garden were changed into 6 tall footmen. And now, coach, ponies and servants were all ready to take Cinderella to the ball. "But, fairy godmother," said Cinderella rather anxiously, "how can I go to the palace dressed like this?" She looked at her ragged frock. Smiling, the fairy godmother waved her wand once more, and instantly Cinderella was gowned like a princess, with a fine rope of pearls round her neck, and on her feet a pair of beautiful slippers of spun glass, and they glittered like diamonds. "Now," said the fairy godmother, "off you go to the ball, but remember this, you must leave the palace before midnight. If you stay a moment longer, your coach, ponies and servants will all return to their former shape, and you yourself will be dressed in rags." Promising to leave the ball in good time, Cinderella, her heart full of joy, thanked her fairy godmother for all she had done. Then the footman handed her into the coach, the coachman cracked his whip, and off they drove in fine style. There was great excitement at the palace when Cinderella's coach drove up, and news was quickly carried to the prince that a beautiful princess had arrived. The prince went out himself to receive her and took her into the ballroom. All the guests had to admit they'd never seen anyone so lovely, and were not in the least surprised that the prince danced with no one else all the evening. Cinderella was so happy, she didn't notice the time. And it was not until the first stroke of midnight started to ring out from the great clock in the ballroom that she remembered her promise to her fairy godmother. Instantly, she ran from the room as fast as she could, and at the head of the great staircase, one of her glass slippers fell off. Not daring to stop and put it on again, she hurried down the staircase and was running out of the palace just as the last stroke of 12 was sounding. At that moment, her beautiful dress fell from her, and she was wearing her ragged clothes again. All that remained of her grandeur was the other glass slipper. Slipping this into her pocket, Cinderella ran all the way home in her bare feet, arriving panting and breathless. Back at the palace, the prince was in a state of complete bewilderment. When his beautiful partner had suddenly run away from him, he had, of course, hurried after her, but she had been too quick for him, and now all that he had left of the girl who had won his heart was a tiny glass slipper. The next day the prince issued a proclamation. He would marry the lady who could wear the glass slipper which had been found in the palace. Round the city went the heralds, and many were the ladies who tried to squeeze their feet into the glass slipper, but it was too small for any of them. It was much, much too small for either of the stepsisters, though they both tried with all their might to get it on. Cinderella watched very quietly, and then she said, "May I try?" "You?" said the stepsisters. "Who ever heard of anything so absurd?" But their scorn turned to astonishment and wonder when the glass slipper was seen to fit perfectly onto Cinderella's dainty little foot. And when she quietly drew out of her pocket the other glass slipper and put it on her other foot, so that the two matched perfectly, they were too ashamed to do anything but fall on their knees and beg Cinderella's forgiveness, which Cinderella willingly gave them. Whereupon Cinderella's fairy godmother reappeared and once again gave her lovely clothes and a lovely carriage in which she could return to the palace and be reunited with her prince. The prince welcomed her with open arms and promptly made arrangements for the most magnificent wedding the land had ever known. And just in case this story has made you think to yourself, "I wish I had a fairy godmother," remember this. Perhaps you have, but you can't be sure if you're not every bit as sunny-natured, sweet-tempered, kind-hearted and loving as Cinderella was.